A number of philosophers reading Anselm's Proslogion, specifically chapter 3 in his reply to Gaunilo, have thought that there's actually a different ontological argument there. Maybe Anselm isn't clearly distinguishing it from the first, but still, it's a really interesting argument, and I think this argument is more interesting than the first one that we looked at, and this one is still in some ways a continuing matter of discussion among philosophers. There are still books and articles being written about this type of argument. But to get you to understand the argument, I need you to make some distinctions. We're going to talk now about four different sorts of things, four things that we can think of. And we're asking, what category does God belong in? Again, we're not assuming that God exists, as you'll see. We're just trying to figure out whether we can tell which sort of thing he would have to be. A contingent thing is something which exists and can not exist. In other words, it's not contradictory to suppose that it doesn't exist, that it never existed. What sort of things are contingent things that exist, yet it's conceivable that they not exist? Well, you're a contingent being, right? You didn't have to have been born. We could imagine a history of the world which doesn't include you. Maybe your parents never got married, for instance. You're a contingent thing. I'm a contingent thing. Look, the whole earth is a contingent thing. It's coherent to suppose that the earth never formed or that life never arose. Just about anything that you can think of is that's real is a contingent thing. All physical things are contingent things. For any physical thing, it's possible that it not exist. If certain physical conditions were changed, now it would cease to exist. Whether you're talking about a planet or a human being or a tree or a rock or a mountain or an ocean. And also for any physical thing, if physical circumstances had been different a long time ago, it would not have come into existence. So most real things that you can imagine are contingent things. Excuse me, going the wrong direction. Secondly, what about the concept of something that exists and can't not exist? Now we have the concept of necessary truths, things which are true and couldn't be false, right? That's true, and it couldn't conceivably be false. It's contradictory to suppose that it's false. Whereas this is true, but it could have been false. It's not contradictory to suppose that it is false. So just as there are necessary truths and contingent truths, we have a concept of a contingent thing and the concept of a necessary thing. A necessary thing is something which is real, and it can't not exist. There's some contradiction involved in supposing that it doesn't exist. Great, what's an example of this? Well, there isn't any uncontroversial example of this. No physical thing is a necessary thing. For any physical thing there, even the whole cosmos, it doesn't seem that it couldn't not exist. It seems that it could not exist. Supposing it to not exist seems consistent, not contradictory. So there aren't any physical examples of this. Some philosophers believe in abstracta, like numbers, abstract objects, and they think some of those are necessary. But not all philosophers believe in that sort of entity. So there aren't any really uncontroversial example of necessarily existing things. So I'm not going to give an example that everyone would agree on for that. But it is a concept that we have, right? Third, we have the concept of a merely possible thing, something that doesn't exist but could exist. So it's not real, it's not actual, but there's no contradiction in supposing that it had been actual. So take my friend Robin Hood here. Right, this guy that runs around in green tights and has a band of merry men, and they're good at shooting bows and arrows, and they steal from the rich and give to the poor. Is it possible there be a guy like that? Sure. As far as we know, there wasn't. I'm assuming that's all legend. It doesn't exist, but he could exist. There's no contradiction in supposing he exists. Lots of interesting things are merely possible. Pigs that fly, superheroes, Zeus. Okay, but now we're in the realm of the unreal. There's one more other sort of unreal thing. That which is impossible. Something which doesn't exist and also could not exist. So it isn't real, and it's actually contradictory to suppose that it's real. Now consider this figure over here. It's not an impossible thing. We know that because it's an actual thing, right? It's really on your screen. These lines, this figure here, it's not impossible. It's a contingent real thing, but what it represents is impossible, right? It represents, this kind of stool-like thing, but right, which has three dimensions, but it's not the kind of thing which could exist. So it itself is possible, but it's a representation of an impossible object. Another impossible object would be, somebody that does and doesn't exist at the same time, someone that's 6 foot tall and also not 6 feet tall at the same time in the same respect. Okay, well, let me give you a graphical preview of this second argument. The argument goes like this. Everything got to be in one of these four categories. The question is, where does God belong? It turns out when you properly understand the concept of God, you'll see that God can't be contingent and can't be merely possible. So God is either necessary or impossible, but he's not impossible. So guess what? God exists and can't not exist. Of course, it follows from that he exists. In different language, God is a necessary being. So that's the graphical preview of how the argument works. Now let's actually run through the premises and see how it's put together. So here's another ontological argument from Proslogion chapter 3 and his reply to Gaunilo. And a lot of philosophers would call this a modal ontological argument. It has to do with modes or ways things can be. Modal, A-L. It has to do with what has to be and what can't be, or it has to do with ways of being. So sometimes those are called modes. Many would call this a modal ontological argument. And you'll find if you read the philosophical literature, there are many, many versions of this, going back to Anselm, but clearly expressed in the early modern era, in the late 1600s specifically. So the first premise says that necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. This is an independent premise. And it's saying that necessary existence, if you've got something which has contingent existence, you would make it greater by giving it necessary existence. Or one and the same thing, if you suppose it had contingent existence, it'd be less great in that scenario. It'd be greater in the scenario where it had necessary existence. Now this is a plausible premise, and it's not, it doesn't assume that plain old existence is a property. Look, you would be greater if you were all-knowing, right? You would be greater if you were perfectly good, not just somewhat good. And arguably, you would be greater if you had necessary existence, rather than contingent. So you exist, but something could make you cease to exist, right? A lot of people believe that they cease to exist when they die. But even if you don't think that, an all-powerful being could make you cease to exist, could annihilate both body and soul, right? If you had necessary existence, not even an all-powerful, not even an omnipotent being could annihilate you. Also, if you had necessary existence, it would follow that you had always existed. You would be eternal. There can't be a time at which something that has necessary existence doesn't exist, because it's contradictory to suppose it doesn't exist. So this is plausible, right? You would be greater if you had necessary existence than if you only have contingent existence. Second premise says exactly one of these is true. A, God is necessary. B, God is contingent. C, God is merely possible. D, God is impossible. Those are just the four concepts, the four categories we just went through. And we're not presupposing God's existence, right? On the first two, he exists. On the second two, God does not exist. Right, so those seem to be all the options that there are. This premise seems pretty impossible to attack. I mean, isn't anything gonna go into one of those four categories? Third, God is by definition the greatest possible being. That's another independent premise. And again, it doesn't look like you want to challenge that because there's this by definition part here, right? This is just how we're using the term. The idea is that God is the greatest being that there could be. It's not coherent to suppose there's a greater one. So integers don't have a top level. There's always a greater integer than any integer that you can name. But the idea here is that beings do have a top level. It is coherent to suppose that there is a greatest possible being. And let's say that's what we mean by God. Okay, those are almost all the premises we need. We'll throw in one more premise in a second. Don't get impatient. The argument isn't that long. You'll see how it flows if you'll just walk through it with me. So the fourth step says that B is false. It's false that God is contingent. And this follows from 1 and 3. If necessary existence is greater than contingent existence, God is by definition the greatest being there could possibly be. Well, then he'd have to have necessary existence if he existed, right? He couldn't have merely contingent existence because necessary existence is greater, and he's the greatest possible being. So it's actually not coherent. Then the argument is saying that option B is true, that God is contingent. We can rule that out. Step 5, no merely possible being is the greatest possible being. And this follows from 1. If a being is merely possible, it doesn't have necessary existence. That seems to follow from 1. And so it follows from that C is false. That follows from 5. Option C is that God is a merely possible being. A merely possible being isn't the kind of being that exists no matter what. A merely possible being is not the kind of being whose non-existence is contradictory. The greatest possible being has to be one whose non-existence is contradictory. Okay, so we've just ruled out B and C. And then it follows that either A or D is true. That follows from 2, 4, and 6, right? We're down to 2 options. Okay, one more premise. It says the claim that God exists doesn't imply a contradiction. That's a new independent premise, and we'll need to inquire why one should think this is true in a minute. But look, saying there's a man who exists and doesn't exist at the same time, that implies a contradiction. Saying there's a figure which is both a square and a circle, that implies a contradiction. But just supposing monotheism, that there's this perfect being, everything else was created by this being, where's the contradiction? So premise 8 seems true. But if premise 8 is true, then option D is false. So that follows from 8. Option D is that God is an impossible being, a being whose existence is contradictory. And look, there was only 4 options. We just argued that 3 of them involve contradictions. Well, then the only one that remains has to be true. So this follows from 2, 4, 6, and 8. That A is true, and of course it follows from that God exists. So we've proven that God exists, right? In a second we'll look at objections.